The dust in Harlow Ridge always settled slow, like the town itself had no appetite for haste. Morning sun bled through the spaces between slatted shutters, draping the town square in a sleepy golden hush. But on this morning, there was no peace in the air, just the crackling anticipation of cruelty dressed in law. Men leaned against hitching posts and women peered from shaded porches, their eyes narrowed beneath bonnets or brims, watching the makeshift stage of crates nailed together with more malice than mercy. A girl stood atop it, no more than 17, her calico dress clinging to bony shoulders, her bare feet pressed flat against the sun-warmed wood as if trying to ground herself in something that wouldn't betray her. She didn't tremble, but she didn't lift her chin either. She looked neither proud nor broken, just waiting. Her name wasn't offered. No backstory. Just lot number 6, spoken flat by a man who smelled of sweat and ink, flapping a ledger with disinterest. Behind him stood the buyer, a man named Jed Craven, known gambler, whiskey-slicked, and proud of the way he spat. $1, someone muttered. 5, barked another. 10. Jed's voice came clear and cocky. For the little wildcat. The girl flinched, not at the number, but at the laughter that followed. And in that brittle moment, just as her fingers tightened into the folds of her skirt, the town held its breath. That's when it happened. Jed stepped forward, reached up, and slapped her. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to brand. Not the skin, no, but the space she took up in the world. The way her shoulders folded in, the way her mouth twitched to hold back tears, was louder than any shout could have been. No one moved. Not Sheriff Hoyt, who stood nearby pretending to relight his pipe. Not the preacher's wife, who pressed gloved fingers against her lips but said nothing. Not the crowd, who looked away with the practiced ease of people who'd learned that silence was easier than conscience. Except for one man. Leaning in the shadow between saloon and feed store, arms crossed, hat low over his brow, stood Silas Boone. Rancher. Widower. A man who had once loved so fiercely that the whole town heard him sob when they lowered his wife into the earth last spring. Since then, he hadn't spoken much. Hadn't looked much, either. Just worked his land, paid his dues, and disappeared before sundown. But now, Silas straightened. His boots, worn and dusty, moved slowly forward, each step deliberate, like a man crossing into a place he swore he'd never go again. He didn't speak. Didn't call Jed out or wave a gun. He simply walked toward the platform, eyes never leaving the girl's face. She looked at him once, just once, and something flickered behind her stoicism. Not recognition, but the faintest shape of hope. Silas stepped up to the sheriff's table and laid down his rifle. Then, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a single gold coin. It rang out as it hit the table, louder than any slap, any bid, any whispered judgment. Jed scoffed. "She's mine. You can't just." Silas turned to him slowly, his voice low, dust dry from months of disuse. "She was never yours." The silence that followed was sharper than any blade. Jed looked around, waiting for someone to back him up. No one did. Not even Hoyt. "You gonna fight me for her, Boone?" Jed sneered. Silas shook his head. "I buried the last thing I loved. I'm not here to lose again." He turned back to the girl, held out his hand, rough, scarred, weather-worn. She stared at it for a long moment, then stepped down from the crate and took it. No one cheered. No one stopped them. The crowd simply parted as the two walked away, slowly, side by side, like smoke rising from a fire no one had thought to put out. Behind them, Clara Bell, owner of the local tavern, muttered just loud enough for those closest to hear, "Well, I'll be damned. That's the first time a man bought something at auction and gave it back its name." And somewhere, beneath the dust and judgment, something in the town began to shift. In his cabin that night, Silas placed a bowl of stew in front of the girl. She didn't ask what was in it. She ate slowly, watching him from under lashes darkened with road grime and sorrow. He didn't ask her name. Didn't speak at all. He just set down a folded blanket, left a small oil lamp burning, and stepped outside, leaving the door ajar behind him. Under the moonlight, he sat in the rocking chair his wife once favored, the wood groaning under his weight like it remembered better days. Inside, he could hear the girl moving, soft, careful, not yet trusting the quiet. He didn't need her gratitude. He wasn't sure he deserved it. But for the first time in a long while, Silas Boone didn't feel alone in the world. And for a man made hollow by loss, that small ache of presence was more than enough to start stitching a soul back together. Somewhere in the far distance, a wolf howled low. Not a threat, but a warning. Silas listened, then whispered to the dark, "Not this time." And inside, the girl pulled the blanket to her chest, and didn't cry. The weeks that followed moved like honey in winter, slow, thick, and strangely sweet for those who paid attention. In the cabin on the edge of Harlow Ridge, two souls existed like wary shadows crossing paths. Silas Boone worked his land without complaint, his hands in the soil, his heart still half buried with the woman he'd lost. And Maybelle, the girl who'd once been a number on an auction crate, rose before the sun and swept the porch with the quiet grace of someone unsure if she belonged anywhere at all. They spoke little. At first, not at all. Their days passed in the language of gesture, a bowl of water placed gently by the hearth, a coat mended without mention, a steaming biscuit wrapped in cloth and left on the windowsill. She didn't ask what he expected. He never asked what she had endured. But in their silences, something began to bloom, slow as spring thaw. A recognition. A rhythm. The town watched with a hunger for scandal. At Clara Belle's tavern, tongues clacked like shutters in a windstorm. He's twice her age. It ain't decent. She'll run off, you mark it. But each morning, as the sun peeled the frost off the grass, there she was, hauling water from the well, brushing the mule's flanks, humming songs without words. The whispers only made her quieter. And Silas? He seemed unchanged on the surface, yet he began to linger on his walks, let the stove burn longer at night, left the porch light flickering even after he'd gone to bed. On the third Sunday, Clara herself came riding up the hill. She brought bread, but not out of kindness, more like curiosity cloaked in crust. Silas opened the door and nodded. Maybelle met her at the threshold, chin slightly lifted, hands flour-dusted from kneading. Clara looked her over like she was a story half told. "You all right, girl?" she asked. Maybelle nodded. "He lets me be." Clara blinked, then laughed once, soft and low. "That's worth more than most folk ever get. You hold on to that." And then, as quick as she came, Clara left. But the peace did not last. Jed Craven returned under the cloak of twilight, drunk and swollen with wounded pride. He stumbled through the saloon, knocked over a chair, demanded a drink, then 5 more. By the time the moon climbed over the church steeple, his voice was echoing through the street. "She's mine," he bellowed. "Bought and paid. That rancher stole from me. What kind of law's that?" No one answered. Not the sheriff, who stirred his drink in the corner, not the preacher, who ducked into his office, and not Clara, who merely reached for her shotgun and set it on the bar without a word. But the next morning, Jed rode up to the Boone ranch with whiskey fire in his eyes and blood humming in his knuckles. Silas heard the hooves before he saw the man. He stepped out of the barn, hay on his shoulders, a hammer still in hand. Maybelle stood behind the curtain, breath caught in her throat. Jed didn't dismount. "You think you can just take what ain't yours and hide it in the hills like a scared coyote?" Silas dropped the hammer gently on a stump. "She ain't yours, Jed. Wasn't ever. She was on the block. I won the bid. You bought silence and fear, not a person." Jed spat. "You're a sad old man playing hero for a girl who don't even want you." Silas didn't flinch. "I'm not her hero. I'm just a man trying to make up for being quiet too long." Jed's hand hovered near his holster. From the porch, Maybelle stepped out. She wore the same shawl every day now, Annie Boone's, stitched with faded violets and worn at the edges. It hung off her shoulders like something borrowed from another life. Her voice was small, but her words cut. "You laid hands on me, Mr. Craven. In front of God and everybody. What you bought wasn't a girl, it was your own shame." Jed turned crimson. "You calling me a liar?" "No," she said. "I'm calling you forgotten." That did it. He swung out of the saddle with a roar. But before he could step forward, a sound broke the air, not a gunshot, but something colder. Clara Belle stood on the rise, shotgun aimed steady. "Back in your saddle, Jed," she said. "You ain't wanted up here. You try to come any closer, and we'll be plantin' you under the cottonwoods." Jed froze. For the first time, truly, he looked around and saw that more than silence waited for him. There was consequence now. Community. And it did not favor him. He turned his horse hard and rode off without another word. Later that evening, the fire crackled low in the hearth. Maybelle sat on the floor, knees tucked to her chest, staring into the flames like they held secrets older than time. Silas sat in his chair, rocking slow, the wood creaking like it remembered love songs. "You were brave," he said finally. She didn't look up. "I was tired." Silas nodded. "That counts too." He stood and walked outside, leaving the door open like he always did. The stars were bleeding through the blackness overhead, a million flickers of quiet witnesses. He walked out to the edge of the field, where the ground sloped and the wind carried whispers of things that once were. A small fire pit stood there, the kind he hadn't lit in years. He struck a match. Dropped it in. Then, one by one, he placed pieces of a broken rocking chair into the flames. The same chair where Annie had once nursed their son, then sat weeping when he passed from fever. The same chair that had held Silas through the long nights after her death. Maybelle appeared beside him, the shawl drawn close. "You're burnin' it?" she asked. He nodded. I been sittin' in the past too long. Ain't no one left in it but ghosts. She knelt and fed in a splintered leg. Together, they watched it burn. When only embers remained, she stood and held out her hand. Not for saving. Not for comfort. Just invitation. He took it. And under a sky too wide for words, they danced, no music, no rhythm, just the sway of breath and belonging. Not lovers. Not yet. Maybe never. But two people who had survived being unwanted. Who had stitched together some new kind of kinship out of silence and decency and small, sacred mercies. In town, the gossip softened. Maybelle started a reading circle for girls at the back of Clara's saloon. Silas traded his rifle for seed and began clearing a plot for flowers. No one asked what they were to each other. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Maybelle no longer flinched when someone raised a voice, and Silas no longer walked like a man waiting to be punished by the past. Sometimes, the sheriff tipped his hat when he passed. Clara brought over soup with too much pepper and said it was good for the soul. Even old Jed Craven left town soon after, muttering about curses, and curses returned. And if you ever find yourself in Harlow Ridge, they'll point to the cabin on the hill and tell you how a widower once saved a girl with a single gold coin, and how she, in turn, saved him with the smallest thing of all, a second chance. But they'll never quite capture it right. Because the truth is, it wasn't about saving at all. It was about choosing to stay when it would have been easier to leave. About standing between a girl and a slap, between silence and dignity, between memory and fire. And maybe, just maybe, that's what real grace looks like. Not the loud kind. But the quiet thunder of two hearts learning they deserve to be heard.